Once a year, after the sun goes down on the 14th of Nisan, millions of people fill halls all over the world. A plate of unleavened bread is passed from hand to hand. A cup of red wine follows behind it. For Jehovah's Witnesses, this is the holiest night on the calendar, the celebration of Christ's death. And if you watch closely, you'll notice something almost no one talks about. In nearly every room on earth, the bread and the wine travel down the rows and no one touches them. They're refused, passed along, handed to the next person and the next until they come back untouched. Now imagine the rule deciding who is even allowed to reach out and take those emblems is about to change. Not slightly, drastically. Imagine that behind the theological scenes at Watchtower headquarters, the strings are already being pulled so that one day only an ultra-restricted group of men at the very top of the organization may partake at all, and everyone else, all 20 million of them, becomes nothing more than a spectator. To someone on the outside, that sounds impossible. Even to most people inside, it sounds impossible. This is the base of the religion's identity, and it has been for decades. But before you dismiss it, look at what this organization has already done. Rigid rules on blood transfusions have shifted, including the quiet acceptance of a member's own stored blood. Standards on beards have changed. Standards on clothing have changed. Even the rule on whether you are allowed to greet someone who has been disfellowshipped changed, practically overnight. Once you've watched a religion rewrite its most absolute rules and call it spiritual progress, one question stops sounding paranoid and starts sounding obvious. If they can change all of that, what makes anyone think the way the organization handles the celebration is untouchable? Here's what this video is going to do. We're going to examine the evidence, not from critics, not from speculation, from the Watchtower's own publications, their own magazines, their own statistics, printed under their own name. And when you line it all up, you'll see how a mathematical trap created by the organization's own growth, combined with a single theological adjustment made in 2013, has left the governing body cornered, and the only logical exit is to change the doctrine of the celebration itself. This isn't prophecy. It's a reading of the paper trail. Let's follow it. Start with the number at the center of everything, 144,000. For almost a century, official theology held that the number of Christians with a heavenly hope was limited to exactly 144,000 literal individuals, the figure drawn from Revelation chapters 7 and 14. Everyone else, the millions of faithful witnesses filling those halls, could hope for eternal life on a paradise earth, but never a place in that heavenly government. And only that capped group, the ones they call the anointed, were permitted to eat the bread and drink the wine at the celebration. Everyone else watched. That's why the plate goes by untouched. And there was a second piece, just as firm. The organization taught that the heavenly calling had closed definitively in the year 1935. That detail mattered more than it looks because it turned the celebration into a clock. The logic was simple, the way they taught it. If the door shut in 1935, then the anointed still on earth would age and die, one by one, and the number of partakers would fall a little more every year until it finally reached zero. And that was the sign Armageddon had arrived. The empty plate wasn't just theology, it was a countdown. And for a while, the countdown behaved exactly the way it was supposed to. In the 1930s, there were more than 50,000 partakers worldwide. Decade after decade, the number kept dropping. By the 2000s, it had fallen to around 8,500. The line was going down, the clock was ticking, everything was on schedule, and then it stopped falling. And then it did the one thing the Doctrine had no answer for. It reversed. By the mid-2000s, new people were standing up and declaring themselves anointed. The number wasn't just holding steady, it was pushing back up. And in 2007, the governing body pulled out the wall the entire structure was leaning on. In its own magazine that year, the Watchtower stated plainly that no specific date could actually be set for when the heavenly calling ends. In a single sentence, the 1935 cutoff, the teaching that had anchored the countdown for 70 years, was gone. The result was a statistical free-for-all. With the door quietly reopened, the number of partakers didn't just inch up. It jumped, and it has never stopped. From around 8,500 to over 24,000 in the most recent reports, climbing in what can only be described as geometric progression. 22,312 in 2023, 23,212 in 2024, 24,576 in the 2025 report. Up every single year. accelerating. Now sit with what that does to the doctrine. The teaching says only 144,000 humans go to heaven across all of human history. So start counting. Add the anointed Christians of the first century. Add every faithful anointed one across the 2,000 years since. Then add the more than 180,000 that the Watchtower has itself tallied as partakers, going all the way back to the days of Russell and Rutherford. That running total blew past 144,000 a long time ago. And if the number alive on Earth keeps growing, the doctrine of a literal 144,000 doesn't just get uncomfortable, it enters public collapse. The growth has to be stopped. The question is how. So hold that broken math in your mind, a count that's supposed to fall but keeps climbing. And let me show you how the ground was prepared. Because the tools to close that door were laid down in the publications years ago, in plain sight, and nobody outside the system noticed the pattern until all the pieces were in position. Go back and look at how this organization has always divided the Bible. For decades, Watchtower literature drew a hard line down the middle of it. The Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, applied to the nation of Israel in the flesh. But the Greek Scriptures, the New Testament, applied primarily to what they call the Israel of God. Spiritual Israel, the anointed. You can trace that dividing line through editions of the Watchtower from 1961 and again in 2008. The same distinction, restated across the decades. And the part that matters is this. Within that framework, the instructions for the Christian congregation belong to spiritual Israel alone, not to the millions on the outside, to the covenant class. Then they took it a step further. In the magazine dated March 15, 1985, the organization reached back to the Jewish Passover for a direct parallel. Under the Mosaic Law, someone who was ceremonially unclean or traveling could observe the Passover 30 days later. And the Watchtower applied that rule directly to spiritual Israel, using it to argue that the rules for direct participation in the Lord's evening meal are the exclusive domain of one specific group. The group they call the faithful and discreet slave. Hold on to that phrase, faithful and discreet slave. Because in 2013, the meaning of it changed completely, and almost no one on the outside understood how much was riding on it. Up until July of 2013, the doctrine was clear, and it was broad. The faithful and discreet slave was all of the anointed, the entire body of 144,000 living on earth, collectively feeding the flock. But in the historic Watchtower of July 15, 2013, the governing body rewrote it drastically. They declared that the faithful and discreet slave was not the whole anointed body at all. It was only the members of the governing body acting together at their world headquarters. In their own words, in that issue, a small group of anointed brothers who prepare and dispense spiritual food during Christ's presence, and today, those brothers make up the governing body. A handful of men. That's who the slave became. That was the theological masterstroke. Now watch the gears mesh, because every piece came from their own hand. The instructions for the celebration and the covenant for the kingdom were framed for spiritual Israel. That's the dividing line running through decades of their magazines. The publications then tie spiritual Israel directly to the faithful and discreet slave. That's the Passover parallel from 1985. And as of 2013, the faithful and discreet slave is no longer the anointed as a whole. It is only the governing body. Read those three moves in sequence, and the funnel is undeniable. The covenant narrows to spiritual Israel. Spiritual Israel narrows to the slave. The slave narrows to a handful of men at headquarters. Everything, the covenant, the meal, the legal spiritual right to eat and drink, now pours down into a single point at the very top of the pyramid. The theological machinery is fully assembled. To restrict participation and eliminate the problem of the growing anointed count, all that remains is for the governing body to declare that only the slave, meaning themselves, holds the right to consume the emblems. The engine is built. It just hasn't been turned on. And if you're wondering whether they could ever get away with a reversal that enormous, you already know the answer, because they've had the perfect tool for it all along. They call it new light. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 18. The path of the righteous shining brighter and brighter. The governing body has an almost flawless defense mechanism for any change of direction, the concept of new truths or progressive light. So here's how it would actually sound when it comes. They won't say they were wrong. They will argue that Jehovah lovingly saw fit to clarify that consuming the bread and the wine was always a responsibility tied directly to the management of the kingdom on earth, something that belongs exclusively to the central leadership. the slave. The more than 24,000 current partakers would be subtly disqualified, perhaps under the claim of emotional misunderstanding, perhaps under the framing that they lacked the theological standing they sincerely believed they had. Either way, they would be moved aside. And the celebration? The celebration would go on exactly as before. Same night, same hall, same bread, same wine, except the emblems would never leave the front of the room. They would be consumed, symbolically or literally, only by the leadership. And the more than 20 million attendees around the world would become purely spectators of a report or a talk, while the count that has embarrassed the doctrine for nearly 2 decades finally comes back under total institutional control. And here is the hardest part to sit with. The membership would accept it. The history shows that the base accepts radical changes not with resistance, but with ease and applause. Standing ovations at annual meetings where teachings held as sacred truth for decades are reversed on a Saturday afternoon, and the room doesn't gasp, it claps. Because the framework was never about the specific rule, it was about trusting the men who set the rule. Once you've been trained to greet every reversal as a blessing, a fresh reversal doesn't feel like a crisis, it feels like clarity. So the question in the title is not a thought experiment. It is a conclusion based on mathematics and editorial logic. The governing body created this problem the moment it centralized the power of the faithful and discreet slave into itself in 2013, all while watching the number of supposed anointed skyrocket around the world in a way it cannot control. Changing the doctrine of the celebration would not be the first taboo this organization has broken to keep the narrative under control and avoid the embarrassment of math that doesn't add up. It almost certainly would not be the last. The theological board is already set. The pieces, old publications and new, have already been moved. Now it is simply a matter of timing and institutional convenience for the announcement to be made, which leaves one reflection, and it belongs to you. Looking at all of these theological gears and the speed at which the rules have been changing in the last few years, how far can the leadership alter the foundations of faith for millions of people before the structure itself begins to show the strain? If this change comes, will you be ready to accept it as new light? Or will it be the limit of your line of questioning?